Hello everyone, I'm Mitch from Inventory Hive and I want to thank everyone today who's registered for today's webinar. We've had over 300 registrants for this webinar, so the uptake on this has been really good. So thanks to each and every one of you for registering and taking part today. I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by Richard Abbots from Inventory Hive and Martin Wilks from the Tenancy Deposit Scheme as we discuss the importance of management visits, or also known as interim inspections. So Martin and Richard, if you want to start, if you want to do a quick introduction about yourself, and then we can pass over to Martin as well.
Yep, so I'm the founder of Inventory Hive. So in a nutshell, we're beautifully simple cloud-based property inspection and virtual tour software. We work with letting agents, property management providers throughout the UK, from big groups managing tens of thousands of properties right through to smaller independents. And I've been working alongside TDS over the last couple of years with training content and generally looking at how we can collaborate to create best practice in terms of property inspections, property inventories, so on and so forth.
Perfect. And yourself, Martin?
Yes, I'm Martin Wilks. I'm an adjudicator at TDS. I've been with TDS now for almost 9 years, so I've dealt with thousands of disputes in that time. I also get involved on the TDS Academy, so I present some of the live training that we deliver there. And before I came to TDS, I worked as a lawyer in mostly landlord and tenant. And before that, I was in-house counsel at a housing association. So I've seen the social housing side of property management as well.
Brilliant. So you've seen it all, basically. You've seen it all. So
well, I don't like to say that much, but I've seen quite a lot. I never say all. I still often am surprised in my day-to-day work. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, lovely. Just before we get started into the main body of today's webinar, I'm just going to go through a couple of house rules. So as I mentioned at the start, we've had over 300 registrants for this webinar. So it'll be fairly difficult to take any live questions on today's webinar. But if you do have any questions, pop them in the Q&A box and we'll make sure we respond back to those in the next 3 to 5 days after the webinar's finished. So any questions, just pop them in the box and we'll have a look through them and we'll respond back to you individually. And also as well, we'll touch on this later on in the webinar, but there's a couple of free handouts as well. So in the handouts section of the webinar, there is an example pre-checkout report and a guide on interim visits, which you can download from the handout section as well. So do have a look at those, but we'll remind you of those later on as well. So let's get started. So the first topic we're going to discuss today is why do interim visits? So obviously it's important to do them. So Richard, if you want to make a start on why it's important to do these interim inspections.
Yeah, sure. I think this is one of those questions as well that's definitely evolved over time in terms of the importance of doing an interim visit, which have all sorts of names. We come across management visits, property inspections. They're all essentially one and the same, and they're there to harness the relationship between the landlord, the agent and the tenant. They're there to protect the tenant, make sure the property is maintained and kept safe. Equally, for the landlord, it's also to ensure that the property is being looked after in accordance with the tenancy agreement, to make sure that everything's being maintained. I think some of the terminology that you may come across is, the tenant, to ensure the tenant's behaving in a tenant-like manner. So that refers to implied terms in terms of the Landlord and Tenant Act. So ensuring that the tenant is maintaining the property in an appropriate way. So there's 3 elements to this that is perhaps the most concise way of describing it. So the first one is compliance with the landlord's repairing obligations. So by doing a routine visit and attending the property, which of course was difficult during COVID times, and a lot of agents are trying to sort of catch up with their backlog, but they are vital for ensuring that dialogue between the tenant and the landlord is maintained. Because, for example, if you don't go to a property and do a visit, in some cases, a tenant might have an issue that they deem to be a minor issue. Let's say there's a small, stain on the ceiling. which they don't feel the need to highlight by actually contacting the agent or the landlord out of office hours. Those issues can become what they refer to as permissive waste issues, which, if not addressed early on, can become a bigger issue over time. Now, of course, it's difficult to identify those kind of issues if you're not doing these routine visits. So it's crucial from that perspective. So that's, I would say, the first main point, ensuring that the landlord's repairing obligations are being complied with. The second one is compliance by the tenant with their obligations. So that is, as I mentioned before, making sure that the property is being maintained in a tenant-like manner. And also, of course, making sure that they're complying with any contractual obligations as well. So issues that can arise, such as subletting, smoking within a property, all of those things, some of those things are difficult to identify without physically going and visiting the property in person. And then the third one being compliance with other statutory obligations as well. So demonstrating the property is not overcrowded, and for example, ensuring that the property is not being used as an unlicensed HMO, for example. It's very important for those reasons. But I suppose above and beyond anything else, it is about maintaining that healthy relationship between the tenant and the landlord or the agent, and making sure that the property is safe and being looked after accordingly. So so I suppose those are the main points, but also keen to bring you in on this, Martin, because from an adjudication perspective, I would imagine you tend to deal with things at the end of the tenancy cycle. So how often do you come across interim visits in that respect? How often are they useful, I suppose, is the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say, Rich, that the majority of disputes that we have ultimately rely on a comparison between the check-in and the check-out reports. We're looking to see whether the property has been returned in the same condition, subject to fair wear and tear, and to the same level of cleanliness. But sometimes there are issues that perhaps could have been identified sooner. So, for example, smoking, as you've mentioned, pets in the property. A checkout report might not capture that entirely, or it might be difficult to capture the odor of smoke if the tenant's left all the windows open, and then sure enough, windows are closed. The next day the landlord goes in and they discover this overwhelming smell. Interim inspections in those cases can be really useful to establish this pattern of behavior. If there was evidence partway through the tenancy of smoking, accoutrements or pets, bowls, food bowls, things like that, then it can be really persuasive evidence and help the adjudicator make the correct decision.
Yeah, great.
Perfect stuff. Sorry,
Mitch, I was just going to say as well, Martin, those kind of things wouldn't be so obvious, would they, unless you've actually had to deal with that adjudication process? It's not something I would have been aware of.
No, and we're often on the academy, I'm asked about odours and smells in properties, because that can be really difficult to capture. But ultimately, if a dog's been kept in the property, and a large dog, for a year or 2 years, that smell can actually be quite overwhelming, but it can be masked during that checkout process. And so sometimes these interim inspections do really help. Although generally we are comparing the start and the end of the tenancy, they do sometimes really pay dividends.
Yeah, perfect. Some good points there. So just adding on to this, there's plenty of pros and cons as well, which we've added onto this PowerPoint, which everyone can see here. So I suppose I'll pass this back over to you, Martin. So what are the main pros and cons of doing interim inspections?
Well, I mean, from the adjudication point of view, obviously, waiting until the end of the tenancy, as Rich has already said, potentially there can be increased costs because that damage has been allowed to accrue over time. And so doing the midterm inspection can identify these things early. They can be remedied, because although ultimately the tenant may be liable for these costs, there is still the process of having to claim it at the end. And so you have to prove on balance that you're entitled to the deposit. And sometimes, for a technical reason or because the evidence wasn't captured correctly, an adjudicator isn't able to make an award, or ultimately the court might not be able to make an award. And so the landlord can miss out. And so doing these regular inspections can really protect the landlord's interests here.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, just jumping in on that as well, then I suppose summarising some of the points on that. the point that you made there, Martin, obviously relates to the second bullet point on cost, about the sooner repair issues found, the cheaper it can be fixed. As I mentioned before, it's important to maintain that positive relationship with tenants. Also as well, insurance, as we'll touch upon shortly, without doing regular visits, it can sometimes be a challenge, shall we say, to prove to insurers that the property was routinely inspected to make sure that it was complying with the tenancy agreement, because that can have a bearing on whether those insurance policies are invalid. In terms of value, of course, conducting an interim visit will enable you to preserve the value of the property by keeping it in a good condition. So that kind of summarizes the key pros to doing interim visits, and then the cons, as I'm going to show you on the next slide in a moment, is time. Obviously, coordinating, agreeing convenient times with the tenant, that can be time consuming just to do the office admin, if you like, rather than the actual visit itself. And so there's time and cost implications there, and then of course disruption as well. It's about we lead busy lifestyles, generally speaking, and it's about being able to arrange that time, convenient time with the tenant without causing too much disruption, which is something as well that I'll talk about over the next couple of slides in terms of the frequency of visits and the tenant's right to a quiet enjoyment.
Yeah. You mentioned about the time aspect, Rich, so I suppose that leads on to this slide here, about the office admin time it takes for agents just to arrange those visits with tenants.
Yeah, that's right. We've done quite extensive research at Inventory Hive over the last 6 months with a number of agents and landlords, and really tried to determine typically how they coordinate these types of visits. And it's actually quite shocking, really, that I won't go through this workflow in its entirety, but in terms of communicating a visit with a tenant, establishing whether they're available or not, perhaps rescheduling if the tenant doesn't find the date to be convenient and they're not happy for management keys to be used. All of that process can be time consuming. And then if you add in maintenance on the back of a visit as well, because there is some follow-up action required, that can really have quite a significant impact on office admin, both before and after a visit's taken place. If you take a portfolio of, say, 250 properties, and they're doing, say, 6 monthly visits, so that's 500 inspections every year, based upon office admin time on average of about 23 minutes, that works out to just over 2 days a month for somebody in an agency, in an office, to coordinate those visits. So in terms of admin time, it is quite significant. It's actually something we've been working on a solution for, which I'm not going to discuss today, but that does demonstrate from the cons perspective, just giving this webinar a bit of balance. It can be a burden for agents, particularly as I mentioned before, on the back of COVID, where there are backlogs with these types of visits.
Yeah, perfect stuff. I know you touched on this previously as well, Richard and Martin. So there's access with express authority. So there's some do's and don'ts that I suppose you'd like to mention.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose this is a blend here of best practice and legal requirements. So as a reference before, the Landlord and Tenant Fees Act 1985 is quite explicit in that tenants should be given 24 hours notice. Now, so that is referred to as an implied requirement because it's a legal requirement, but it is generally also expressly referred to in the tenancy agreements that 24 hours notice should be given, so the tenant know to expect that. But I suppose if you look at this practically as well, the bigger window you can give the tenant within reason of letting them know that you're coming to do the visit, it's much fairer for the tenant to do it that way, because if you say we're coming in 2 days' time, it's difficult for somebody with a busy schedule to enable themselves to be in for that, unless of course they're working from home. So therefore, if you give maybe a week or two's notice to a tenant, then you've got more, I suppose you've got an increased likelihood of them being present during a visit. And of course, there are benefits to a tenant being present during a visit, because that's where you can have that dialogue and ask them if they've got any concerns or are there any issues in the property that aren't necessarily obvious from a visual perspective. That's why it's important to make sure that they have that written notice. Now, that written notice doesn't need to be a posted letter, of course. It could be an email, it could be a phone call, it could be a text message, just ensuring that if you do phone them, of course, follow it up with an email just to make sure you've got that audit trail to tell them that you're coming. And of course, as part of that Landlord and Tenant Fees Act as well, it is quite explicit in there that you should arrange inspections at reasonable times of the day. And again, all of this factors into account tenant circumstance and working patterns and so on. But so those are the, I suppose, the do's element, the things that you should be doing. But it's also important to consider that if you have a tenant that is perhaps they don't want you to, they don't want to go ahead with a visit because they don't want you to use the management keys in their absence. It might be that they want to be present. So it's very important to not turn up at the property unannounced and certainly don't enter the property without permission. Because of course the tenants have that right to quiet enjoyment. So another thing worth mentioning on this here, so obviously that express authority in informing the tenant in advance is important. There is a caveat to that as well, of course, in the event of an emergency. So let's just say there's a smell of gas, there's a fire in the property, or flooding coming from the property. In those situations, that 24 hours notice rule doesn't apply. I think generally best practice advice would be in some of those circumstances to attend with the emergency services, because of course, if there's a threat to life, then it kind of overrides that rule of 24 hours notice.
Can I just add on as well? I mean, just as another do really is be persistent as well, because although you should try really hard to work with the tenants to arrange access, in the back of your mind, you should be perhaps wondering why you're unable to gain access because tenants don't want you to enter the property. So be persistent, don't just be put off, because I've seen many cases over the years where the interim inspection hasn't happened despite attempts, and then we get to the end and we understand why that refusal was made.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Martin, as well. And on the next slide, Mitch, we will we'll just talk about refusal of access. And I'll, as I say, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to focus too heavily on the legal aspects, but there are some simple rules of thumb from best practice, and obviously considering the law as well. So essentially, tenants can refuse access to the property. However, that doesn't affect the landlord's right to inspect the property in line with the Landlord and Tenant Fees Act. So as you've just said, Martin, it is in those circumstances, it's important to understand the reasons for refusal of access. Is it due to the time being inconvenient? And if that's the case, as you said, it's a case of working with the tenant to make sure that you can arrange a convenient time. And of course, with that, it's also important to communicate with the tenant why the visit's happening in the first place, because it can be, in some ways, some tenants will feel like it's an invasion of privacy. And therefore, it's important to explain to them that it's about going and making sure that the property is safe and being maintained in accordance with the tenancy agreement, making sure smoke alarms are present as they were when the tenant checked in and so on. So I suppose the important thing to note here is that a blanket refusal by the tenant will generally be in breach of the implied terms in accordance with the the Landlord Act, and also express terms as well, because generally speaking in tenancy agreements you will outline specifically when you're coming to do those visits, how often you'll be doing them. So on that note, Martin, as well, if ever there is issues in regards to refusal of access, my understanding is that TDS have a resolution service for that as well, don't they?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, most people imagine TDS getting involved at the end to resolve the dispute over the deposit, but we do have TDS resolution as well, and it's a conciliation and mediation service with the main aim of tenancy sustainment, really, keeping tenants in properties and keeping the rent coming in. And there are certain things that we can help with, and one of those would be a refusal of access, trying to sit down with the parties and negotiate an agreement to allow those inspections to take place or repairs to take place or things like that, just to make sure the parties stay in the tenancy. It's a free service to use, and you can request a call back on our website and we can let you know whether it's something we can perhaps help with.
Super.
Yeah,
that's great.
That's quite useful to know actually for anyone watching this webinar. So yeah, brilliant. So I suppose the next point is the frequency inspection. So I know we did some feedback, Richard, to some of our users about how often to do them. Like some said they did it every 6 months, every 3 months, every month sometimes. So yeah, so what's your opinion on the frequency of inspections?
Yeah, I think there's a few simple rules with this one really, is that from a general best practice perspective, that you need to consider that too often could be considered as harassment, for example. Tenants do have a right to quiet enjoyment. So if you were turning up, giving the tenant notice once a month to come and inspect the property, that would probably be excessive, although there's no hard fast rule, and it should be circumstantial, because there could be a reason why you've maybe got to go and visit the property on frequently over a short period of time, because there's remedial works, for example. But if it's just a general routine inspection, generally the best practice we come across there is sort of 3 months after the inception of the tenancy, so 3 months after the initial tenancy start date, just to make sure that things are going to plan, and then 6 months thereafter. But again, there's no hard and fast rules. Some agents will really sell their service to landlords and make it clear they'll go every 3 months, for example. And I think it does depend on the type of property as well. But I suppose the important message here is just to ensure that it's not excessive and being deemed as harassment.
Perfect. Did you have anything to add to that, Martin, or was you fairly happy with all of Richard's?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I mean, I can only really call on past experience, but I imagine, as Richard says, it's dependent on the circumstances and perhaps the risk associated with the tenancy as to how frequently you carry out the inspections.
Perfect. Nice stuff. Obviously, there's some insurance implications that I know we touched on earlier. So, Richard, I know you're a bit more clued up about this. So, yeah.
Yeah, sure. And to be fair, it's quite simple, this one. I mean, landlord insurance policies will generally contain a provision for the landlord to maintain the property in a good state of repair. So regular inspections are obviously a fundamental tool for making sure that is an ongoing thing, in order to ensure that the policies are valid. Obviously, every insurance policy is different, but it's often an issue that's overlooked. So we just wanted to draw a bit of attention to that.
Perfect stuff. And pre-checkout report. So on Inventory Hive, obviously, you're allowed to create unlimited property inspection reports from your check-ins, check-outs, and as part of the custom reports feature on Inventory Hive, you can now create pre-checkout reports. We'll put a template on there as well. There's also a sample pre-checkout report you can download in the handout section of this webinar, so do have a look at that. So pre-checkout reports are probably getting a lot more important now. Would you say that's correct, Richard and Martin?
Yeah, sure. So from I suppose from an inspection perspective, the whole purpose of a pre-checkout report is essentially it's a form of an interim visit, because the tenant is still in situ. So, but it's a good opportunity if you've been maintaining those that good relationship, that good line of communication with the tenant, just to highlight to them issues that they may need to address before they vacate the property. In some cases, that could be because there's been an express agreement within the tenancy agreement about maybe tending to gardens, for example, or certain provisions within that. So it's about just making that tenant aware. Really, they shouldn't be lengthy visits. It's not a pre-checkout report is not designed to go and investigate everything within the property. It's just a general observation. So it shouldn't, from an agent perspective, it shouldn't be time consuming. But those that do them often find that they can be really useful in just managing those expectations before the tenant does actually vacate the property.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that TDS has always suggested is best practice, really, is to do a pre-move out inspection to avoid a dispute ultimately, because by going to the property, it enables you to remind the tenants of their contractual obligations, what they're required to do, perhaps remind them of what the check-in report said about the standard of cleanliness, so that they know that they need to clean to the appropriate standards. And one of the other things that I see work really well is to remind the tenant how much it might cost them if there is a breach of the tenancy agreement, because tenants often don't fully understand at this point it might cost them, and so they might think they haven't got time to clean because they've got their eye on the next property and they're going to move, and they think they'll leave the cleaning to just be sorted out by the agent, and then they're faced with a bill for a couple of £100, and it comes as a shock to them, and then that leads us into the dispute because they dispute the cost of the work that's been carried out. So I think it's a really good way to focus the minds of the parties, and ultimately, you know, we want the tenant to fulfill their obligations and move out so that the property can be relet quickly and the landlord can get the rent.
No, some good points, very good points. The next slide. So as mentioned earlier on, we've also got an ultimate guide to interim visits. That's also in the handout section of this webinar. So we created this guide along with JMW Solicitors and David Smith. So obviously David's well known in the industry for his legal perspective on the property market. So if you want to download that guide, have a look in the handout section. And something else just to add as well, at the end of this webinar in the next few days, we'll also be sending you an email with these guides, so you've just got them for reference, and also some more information about interim visits. So do keep an eye on emails for that email, which I'll be sending out in the next few days. So perfect stuff. And yeah, so something else that I just wanted to bring everyone's attention to is the TDS Academy approved accreditation courses. So I know, Martin, you run the TDS Foundation and Adjudication courses, which are live sessions. And Richard, we've also done some on-demand courses as well, which users can watch at any time. So that's quite useful as well. So what's the importance of doing these courses? So I know, Martin, if you want to start, because you do the live foundation adjudication courses. So what are the main benefits of these?
Well, the foundation course, we cover the requirements, the legal requirements in relation to deposit protection, serving prescribed information. We look at case law, and then we also start to look at the sorts of evidence that you need to capture with half an eye on the end of the tenancy and the potential for dispute. So we will look at things like the tenancy agreement, the check-in, the check-out report, any renegotiated terms, the midterm inspections, things like this. And then on the adjudication workshop, we look in detail at the principles that govern how we adjudicate deposits. So we'll look at fair wear and tear, we'll look at betterment, and we go through various case studies where we ask your opinion on how you might deal with a dispute if you were the adjudicator, and what award you might make, because you know we have to make sure that the remedies that are sought are reasonable and appropriate. So really in-depth courses, I think they're really useful. They are delivered live currently. I do some of them, some of my colleagues do some of them. But it really is a good way to expand your knowledge and get a better understanding of the principles of dispute resolution.
Super, yeah. And in terms of the first two bullet points there, that the foundation and the adjudication workshop, those two, as you said, Martin, they're live events, so they're quite engaging events. The latter two in this list, the pre-tenancy activity and inventory check-in and the midterm visits and tenancy checkout, they are on-demand courses, and they're very much focused upon guidance for actually going out and creating these reports. How should you be describing things? What type of information should you be capturing in order to have a robust reporting process and make sure that your your properties are compliant, essentially. All four of these courses combined together allow the recipients that attend them to use the TDS Academy approved logo in the footer of their reports as well. So that was all I was going to say on that.
Lovely stuff. Yeah, if anyone wants to attend these courses, then you can just find the courses on the TDS website. So if you just search TDS Academy approved courses, you should stumble across those, no problem. So that pretty much concludes today's webinar. I didn't know, before we finish up, guys, if you had any final thoughts or final comments before we wrap things up.
No, that was everything from me. Try to keep it short and sweet on these things. I know people watching are busy, so but thanks for everybody. Thanks to everybody that's attended today. Much appreciated.
Yeah, I appreciate everyone today, and Martin, thank you. Your expertise has been really useful, and I hope everyone who's attended today has found the webinar extremely useful. Like I said, if you've got any further questions, just drop us an email at info@inventoryhive.co.uk, or get in touch with the Tenancy Deposit Scheme as well, so you can contact them through their website as well. And yeah, so thanks again to everyone. I hope you found it useful, and keep your eye out for our next webinars, which are due in the next few weeks. So yeah, thanks again, guys. Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Martin.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Bye now.
Bye.